Let's continue our questionnaire design by looking at layout and flow. So we're here in step 5 of this process, and I'm just gonna quick scroll. So sorry, mind the scroll. All right, so the order that we put questions in. So we first start with a screen. This is the first question asked. This is to make sure that those who are participating in our survey actually know something about the topics we care about in the survey. So if we are doing a survey about the Gap, have you shopped at the Gap in the past month? So if they answered no to this, we'd say, thank you for completing the survey. Have a nice day. If they said yes, then that would lead them to other questions. Then we tend to have a warm-up question. That warm-up question is going to be immediately after the screen, so we know that they know something about this topic, but it's going to be one that's easy to answer, shows that the survey is easy, generates interest in the topic. So we would ask questions like, how often do you go shopping? This is going to be a question that is either multiple choice or yes, no, so not an open-ended question. It's got to be an easy one, a quick one, a low-risk one, and to get us interested in whatever the topic is. Okay. Then we're going to start to transition and build more interest, and this is going to lead into sections of questions. So this transition here might just be a little blurb that notifies the respondents that the subject or format's going to change. So for the next few questions, we want to ask about your family's TV viewing habits. Or you might not have text for your transition. You might have just more of a header to indicate kind of the next couple questions are all related to a general theme. Then we get into the questions that are in that particular theme. Start with the easier questions in that area once you've transitioned within that particular topic. And then in the middle of that section is where you're going to put more complicated or difficult to answer questions. This is where we have questions where people have to think a little bit harder. We would have ones, for example, where they have to give their perceptions, their preferences. So we put in our itemized rating scales, rate each of the, or things that are even more complicated, like put in a rate. So doing our ranking, where we now have to think even harder, and we now have to figure out, do I like this one more than this one? So in this example, rate each of the following 10 stores on friendliness and their salespeople, scale 1 to 7, indicate which stores you like better. So those are a lot more complicated than do I do something, yes, no, or more generic multiple choice. When we get into the attitude scales, that requires a little bit more brain power. So we put those next. Then what we're going to do then is we'll have open-ended questions within that theme area. So that requires even more brain power. And so this is in a section. We would have the easiest questions first, then the attitude scales, which require a bit more. Then open-ended questions go later in that section because they require the most effort. Then if you have sensitive questions, they're going to go in the back end. Either of that topic or in the back end of your survey overall, because there is that risk in terms of answering the questions. If you put it later in the survey, then it's a bit less threatening because I've already committed all this time and effort. The questions you've asked so far have been okay. I'm willing to give you the bit of this information. At the very, very end of your survey is where your demographic questions go. Like, what is the highest level of education you've attained, or which income bracket do you fall in? These questions are personal, and people, are a bit hesitant to say, I identify as this gender, or I have this amount of income. When you ask at the very end, then again, they've already committed time and they've already answered all the questions. They're more likely to respond to that. You can also ease by telling them why you provide this type of information, or that you're asking for this type of information. So for example, I was doing a survey on what helps students learn. And if you're comparing like our research in terms of what engages students, what does students think help them learn, we want to compare that to research that's been done in the past. Well, the research that was done in the past showed there was a difference between male and female students in how they like to learn and what made them more successful in the classroom. So we offered out the survey to our students to say, okay, well, what engages you? And at the very end of the survey, we asked, do you identify as male or female or other? Write in. And what we got back from students is, why are you asking this question? This is not relevant. This is none of your business. So in future surveys, we did is added a statement to explain that this question is being asked so the results of this particular study can be compared to historical studies which show a gender difference in learning. And that seemed to increase the response rate for later surveys when you explained why it was you were collecting that information. So participants need to know why the information is being collected or used, particularly if it's a more sensitive, threatening type of information. The other key is to put it towards the back at the very end. Now, why ask demographic questions like the highest level of education you've obtained? It's so that you can take questions like they're strongly disagree, strongly agree, and see if those with a high school education have a different attitude than those with a bachelor's degree education, right? So we use these demographic questions to then take the responses from other questions and see if different groups have different opinions. So let's actually look at an example survey, the one I'm talking about in terms of engaging students. So in this particular survey, the first question says, have you completed microeconomics, Econ 100 or 201, and who'd you take it from? So this is going to be the screen question. So if you answered no to question 1, skip to question 7. So we have a screen to see if they can answer this. And in this particular case, because we are using those who have not taken microeconomics as our control, when we measure recall of material from 6 months ago, those who didn't take the course should be the comparison versus those who took the course one way versus those who took the course another way. So we are not in this particular survey removing anyone from completing the survey at all. So our screen is actually a skip as opposed to the screen for the entire survey. There's no response to that first question where it is, thank you very much, have a nice day. And that's because the students completing this survey are students taking macroeconomics. And what we're looking at is what they recall from micro 6 months ago. And we want the group who didn't take micro at all 6 months ago to be a comparison. Okay, so they're the benchmark in terms of the ability to recall econ information. So they're the random guess versus those who took a class that was gamified versus those who took, say, a more traditional learning experience. So here we have our screen/skip, and those who took the course 6 months ago then have these set of questions here. Now these questions here are easy to understand. You'll notice they are a bit more sensitive of nature in terms of the grade, but they are easier to answer than, say, your most memorable experience. So the memorable experience open-ended question, we're sticking here towards the back. So we try to align with this order that we've been talking about, but recognize that, it doesn't always divide up nicely because you also have sections that you have to divide up to. In this particular case here, we have our Likert scale type or itemized rating scale type questions where they strongly agree or strongly disagree. And so we have multiple different statements here, not truly a Likert scale because these are not all phrases describing the same thing. It's actually just itemized rating scales that have been bundled together because they all have the same format to make it quicker to respond. So these are all related to learning. These are all related to engagement. And that section is separate from this section here where we're asking the students to recall from 6 months ago. So notice that because this has the attitude section and the recall of data of knowledge section, it doesn't have necessarily that same nice flow that we would have here. But we do have these groupings, right? We have a attitude kind of grouping. We have a knowledge of facts grouping. And then within those groups, we do want to make it so that there's easier questions first, open-ended questions come later, sensitive questions come in the back. And then what you'll see here at the end here we have the demographic questions, gender and age. And so over time that gender one changed. So it was at one point male, female, other. Then it became what is your gender and let people write in. And then after this version of the survey, it then evolved again to add that explanation as to why this information was being collected at all. Because when we changed it to this line here, what is your gender with open-ended, the response usually was none of your business, why are you asking? So we can mitigate that with some explanation as to why it's being collected. Okay. So your general organization is a screen to see if they should be completing the survey, a warm-up general questions that are easy to answer, transitions into your sections. You may have skip questions to see if whether or not that particular section applies to them. And then once you're in that section, then put your questions as much as possible in order of complexity. Easy questions first to get them into it. Questions that make them think, the attitude scales go next. Questions that are more complicated take more time. Maybe we're having them actually do some ranking. The ones that take more effort and thought to fill out go next. Open-ended go after that. And then we get to the more sensitive questions towards the end, followed by the demographic questions at the very end, which are used to then see if any of these questions have differences based on the groups that they belong to. When you establish your questionnaire flow, there's some key things to remember, which is allow plenty of space for open-ended questions. If you're doing this in SurveyMonkey or in Google, you have a choice between short open-ended responses and more longer ones. If you're asking a question that requires more than a one-word response that they're typing in, make sure you go with the bigger one so that they can feel like they can type it in. Because if they see that they can only see one word of what the paragraph they wrote at a time, they won't like it, they won't be happy. You can put instructions in capital letters just to help separate the instructions from the questions themselves. This is kind of an older school format for this. Sometimes now that capital letters is viewed as being yelled at. So you will see in surveys less of that in terms of having those sections where the explanation, the transition information is in capital form. I don't think this one has any transition stuff in it. It's all just the questions. Yeah. So people debate whether or not to put the instructions in capital letters, maybe in italics, something to separate it from the questions and make it clear to see. But the risk now with capital letters is people do view it as yelling, and we don't want that. Make sure you have a proper introduction. This goes back to our ethics discussions. And this is to gain trust, to make sure we cover our ethical responsibilities. It includes telling people whether the survey is anonymous, who is collecting the information, why are they collecting the information, what are they going to do with it, how long will it take to complete the survey. All right, so we talked about some of that key blurbs, and actually this is the one here from our particular survey. So how long did it take? Who is doing it? Why are they doing it? What's going to happen with the results of it? That's all what you're seeing here. Key information like there is, they can withdraw at any time. They can choose to not answer questions. So go back to our video on ethics to make sure that your blurb covers the appropriate ethical considerations. If you are doing your survey, your questionnaire over the phone, so maybe it is a telephone survey, it is not a written one, you will still need to give that blurb, but it will need to be verbal. So you will need to have some kind of statement that tells them that you're valuing their time, how much time it's going to take, And here you're asking if it's time that's convenient for them, inviting them to respond to the survey and why it's important to hear from them. So you might have some wording such as, hello, my name is, whatever your name is, I'm calling on behalf of whatever company you're doing the survey for. Today or tonight, we are calling to gather opinions regarding whatever the subject is. We are not selling anything. This study will take approximately a certain length and may be monitored and recorded for quality purposes. We'd appreciate your time. May I include your opinions? So this kind of generic intro comes from the Council for Marketing and Opinion Research. And this gives us a little introduction. After that introduction, then we would go into an additional blurb that would have a bit more about that ethical guidelines for the survey before then going into the questions. But when you're doing a verbal questionnaire, there's this extra piece here to make sure that they are interested in participating. Okay. And then you need a proper closing. So we need to thank the respondents for their time. When you do an online survey and they hit submit, you generally have a little blurb at the end that says, thank you for your opinions or your feedback. If you are doing a questionnaire that is verbal, so say over the phone, you might have something like this. Thank you for your time and cooperation. I hope this experience was a pleasant one and that you will participate in other research projects in the future. Please remember that your opinions count. Have a good day or evening. Again, that comes from the Council for Marketing and Opinion Research, a little template for wrapping up a questionnaire that is verbal. So you do tend to have some kind of little ending to thank people for participating. All right, so let's just go back here to our flow for designing our questionnaire. There we go. All right, so we have our research objectives. We have decided how we're going to collect the data. Is it going to be a phone survey? Is it going to be paper? Is it going to be online? We have then looked at whether we're doing open-ended questions, multiple choice, dichotomous questions. We've looked at question wording to make sure we don't have double-barreled questions, that we're clear and concise. We've then looked at the flow, right? We start with a screen, we then warm up, we transition to a topic or theme, we ask easier questions, then we get to ones that require more brain power, more attitude scales, or ones that require them to rate things. Then we get to open-ended questions. We repeat that for the different topics. More sensitive questions go at the very end, and demographic questions go at the very, very end, which we'll then use to see if there's differences by groups. So we've created our survey. We've looked at how we need to have a blurb at the beginning to make sure that people can give informed consent, right? We've met our ethical guidelines, and that we have thanked them at the end for participating. If it's verbal, we have a couple extra statements to make sure that this is the appropriate time and that they're willing to be a part of this research. Once we've prepared that entire questionnaire or survey, we then get a couple people to test it out, so we evaluate the questionnaire. And in our next video, we'll look at what to look for when evaluating the questionnaire.